looking at the iconic picture of Leo Tolstoy dressed as a pilgrim wanderer with a knapsack on his back and walking stick in hand, as you can see here, traversing the road on foot and reading about his escape from home in a similar manner years later, even those minimally acquainted with the writer's life might perceive in these acts a rejection of the world of privilege, wealth, and status in favor of a Buddha-like quest for an ascetic, godly life. But few are probably aware of the powerful archetype inherent to Tolstoy's own native Russian Orthodox Christian culture that the writer evokes by these actions. Tolstoy's likely source of inspiration, the strannik or wanderer, was someone who left the sedentary life of home to embark on a series of peregrinations, most often from monastery to monastery, in an attempt to follow Christ's command to leave everything and follow him, imitating the itinerant lifestyle of the one who, quote, had no place to lay his head, Matthew 8:20, Luke 9:58. In this sense, wandering represents a more radical break with the world than its nearest religious cousin, pilgrimage, since the stranniki, unlike pilgrims, most often never return anywhere. Their continuous peregrination constitutes a deliberately chosen lifestyle rather than a single trip to a holy place. In the words of Tolstoy's contemporary, Nikolai Nekrasov, their departure, quote, was not simply from their homes. They were leaving life, as in normative social life, altogether, end quote. By Tolstoy's time, that is, from the mid-19th to the early 20th century, the strannik had long been a fixture of Russian life. There was, by then, a virtual potpourri of different types of wanderers within the empire, who, in addition to the imitatio Christi motivation, had various other reasons for taking to the road. Russian wanderers then would have included beggars, wandering singers, known as kaliki перехожие, or it can also be pronounced kaliki перехожие. And that comes from the word kalige, the word for the footwear worn by Roman soldiers and also wanderers. So you had kaliki перехожие, who would be chanting spiritual verses or духовные стихи, which could be anything from stories from the Bible, calls to the mother desert, the place of ascetic struggle, or there could be verses about the Kaliki themselves and their adventures. Among wanderers, you could find monks as well as so-called collectors, or zborshiki, which I have here. That is, men authorized by their local parish who wandered from village to village seeking contributions for the construction of a church building or some other improvement, such as a bell, etc. So those were the zborshiki, or collectors. Lastly, I would like to mention that there was an entire sect of Orthodox Old Believers known as the wanderers, the stranniki, or the stranniki biguni, the wanderers, those who flee. Also known as the wandering accord, or the strannicheskoye согласие, who preached that the sedentary life was inherently ungodly and that the true faithful must abandon their homes and wander in light of the coming apocalypse. Though there were a number of exceptions, most wanderers in the broad category were former peasants or belonged to a similar lowly social station. As a religious figure, the wanderer both challenged and paradoxically reinforced the norms of the Orthodox Christian environment that provided his practice's theological raison d'être. On the one hand, the wanderer eschewed the sedentariness that was the foundation for financial stability and social respectability among the peasantry, as well as society at large. Paradoxically, however, the wanderer's firm ideological grounding in the eschatological Orthodox Christian worldview, as well as his personal faith in God, as Tatiana Shipanska notes, quote, marked his co-belonging to the local villagers who were usually believing Orthodox, and his, quote, sharing with them the same normative field. Moreover, the fact that the wanderer asked for shelter and food of his fellow peasants in the name of Christ, or for the sake of Christ, Christa radi, united the peregrinator solicitor with his providers in a system of mutual obligation. This was known as strannichestvo, or the receiving of wanderers. For the wanderer represented that very stranger whom believers were enjoined to accommodate in their homes as part of the biblical command to practice hospitality, Hebrews 13:2, as well as personifying the poor petitioner for room and board, who in the Russian folk legend is really Christ himself in disguise. More importantly, the wanderer was an example, albeit a rather extreme one, of what all Orthodox Christians, and indeed all Christians, are commanded by God to be. That is, seekers of the divine, ready to quit their earthly station, both geographical and professional, if the need arises, in order to answer their spiritual calling. Key to the wanderer's credo was the declaration in the New Testament, "For here we do not have an enduring city, but are looking for the city that is to come." Hebrews 13:14. Before going any further, I feel it is necessary to define the various terms in Russian associated with the practice of wandering and pilgrimage, as they display and shape the dynamism inherent in Russian religious peregrination. So, for example, analyzing the etymology of the Russian word for wanderer, here we have strannik or stranitsa for feminine. And wandering, we have stranstvovanie and strannichestvo. Here we notice that they indeed, all these terms appear to be originally tied most closely to spatial concepts and the ideas of moving through space. The word strannik harkens back to the Slavonic word strana, meaning country, nation, but also, according to lexicographer Vladimir Dail, denoting territory, body of lands. Here I have it here. Territory, body of lands, locality, region, province, land, part of the world. Furthermore, strana is connected to the word prostor, or expanse, and is present in such words as prostranstvo, space, while the adjective stranny, in English strange, also a possible source of the word strannik, according to Dail, indeed originates from strana also, but in the sense of a foreign land or a country or something strange or unfamiliar. It is in this meaning of the word strannik as someone who comes from a strange, unfamiliar place and someone located in a strange, unfamiliar place for him or her, that we see the word used several times in the New Testament. For example, in 1 Peter 2:11, and I have it here in modern Russian, Slavonic, and the King James Version of the English Bible. Here the apostle appeals to his flock as strangers and pilgrims in this world. And the final word you can see here is the word rendered in English as pilgrims. In Russian is strannikov, and in Slavonic is also strannikov. In Hebrews 11:13, the pantheon of martyrs and heroes of the faith are also referred to as strangers and pilgrims on earth, with the first word of that pair once again represented by the same word, stranniki. And you can see that in the Russian and in the Slavonic. Lastly, again, returning to 1 Peter, but here in chapter 1, verse 11, the apostle speaks to Christ's followers, of Christ's followers as sojourning in the world. This is in the Russian synodal translation and in the English, but it is not present in the Slavonic, where a word related to the word for life. The word for life is used instead. But I just wanted to highlight that the word stranствование is noted there. In contrast to странник and странствование, which highlight territory and movement through it, the words for the related activity of pilgrimage emphasizes a more specific place or places. The principal term for pilgrimage in Russian is паломничество. And here, let's go here for a second. Which comes from the Latin word palma, meaning palm, which could either point to palms the pilgrims brought back with them from the Holy Land, or to the fact that the services leading up to Easter, i.e. Palm Sunday, in those services, the church in Palestine utilized palms. Another word for pilgrim is поклонник, поклонница, which comes from the word in Russian поклоняться, поклониться, to bow down or to venerate. And this points more directly to the holy objects and places a pilgrim usually visited and venerated on his or her sacred journey. However, while differences between wandering and pilgrimage certainly exist, as I pointed to earlier, the two spiritual practices have much in common and often are not easily separated. In this regard, I would like to point to two key words in Russian that unite both pilgrimage and wandering. The first is the word хождение, which comes from the word ходить, to go, to walk, to move back and forth. It could denote repeated motion, motion in different directions, and motion to a place or motion across a certain area. Additionally, the word хождение can be used, which I don't have it in Latin script here, so хождение is here, can be used to identify an ancient Russian literary genre, which was used to describe a journey, whether that journey be a religious pilgrimage, as in the case of the life and pilgrimage of the abbot Daniil from the Russian land, or a trip taken for other purposes, such as mercantile ones, as in the case of the journey, хождение, beyond the three seas of Afanasy Nikitin, which describes the latter's travels to India in the 15th century. The other word is bogomolye, which etymologically simply means bringing prayer to God or praying to God. Here you have the word Bog, right? Malit, malitsa, to pray. Interestingly, bogomolye now, as it was in the 19th century, is more often than not used to denote either a pilgrimage to a monastery or other holy site in order to pray and reverence the holy objects contained therein, or a wanderer's act of visiting several holy places. Related to this are the words bogomol, here, bogomol, bogomolets, bogomolka, which again, while etymologically communicating the meaning one who prays to God, are now, as they were in the 19th century, given to both wanderers and pilgrims. There is, it seems, embedded in these terms, an understanding that prayer often involves movement to a space where one is either less distracted by worldly affairs or where one's prayers, or so it is believed, will be rendered more efficacious. Moreover, as Alexandra Kostina points out, motion itself within Russian Orthodox Christianity is often used as a metaphor for spiritual development in a way that is often more ingrained than the general concept of life as a kind of spiritual journey, which is familiar to those of us in the West. So here's more хождение, bogomol, which a pilgrim, masculine, feminine, plural, bogomolцы. Kostina points to the word podvig, for example, which is the word for a spiritual feat or sacrifice, and the word подвижничество, which is used to mean asceticism. And she notes how within those words you can see the root двиг, which is related to the verb двигаться, to move, or движение, the movement. Okay, so that so it's just interesting that like a heroic feat is conceptualized as resulting from motion, moving, shifting, sometimes removing an obstacle or problem. Okay. However, at this point, we should also mention some other words in Russian for someone who continually moves from place to place, which do not have the same close association with Orthodox Christianity. Here we have the words skitalets or bradyaga. Skitalets from the verb skitatsa, which also means to wander, but it doesn't have the same religious connotation. It usually denotes wandering without any specific objective, indicating indecision rather than conviction or belief. Bradyaga, for its part, is often translated as vagrant or tramp. These words, skitalets and bradyaga, are at times used derogatorily, but they don't always have to be. Moreover, their adjectival forms, skitalchesky and bradyashi, bradyachi or bradyaji, are often employed quite clinically and without any pejorative coloring. As, for example, the phrase skitaichеский образ жизни, a wandering way of life, itinerant way of life, or in regards to Sergei Maksimov's ethnographic study of various types of wandering, which bears the title Бродящая Русь Христа ради, which is often translated as Wandering Rus for the sake of Christ. Here, however, we must mention a certain negative use of the word bradyaga, or vagrant, and this is its application in the jurisdictional sphere to denote a violation of the law. More specifically, bradyaga in the Code of Criminal Correctional Punishments, published in 1845, was used by the Tsarist authorities as a label for those who failed to secure the proper permissions and documentation, either for residing in their current location or for conducting a pilgrimage through and or collecting in that region. This could also mean that such vagrants did not carry the internal passports required of citizens of the empire. And when the latter were apprehended by the authorities and asked to provide the information contained in these documents, they refused to do so. Such wandering behavior, or bradyajistva, as I have here, or bradyajnichestvo, was punishable either by forced recruitment into the army or into a penal brigade, following which it was recommended that the offender be sent either, quote, beyond the Caucasus or to Siberian or other distant provinces. Okay, I'd like to speak a little bit now, give a little brief history of wandering and pilgrimage. It's kind of a little bit of its prehistory before the 19th century, which is the main thrust of my talk, but just want to a little bit about its sort of origin, and I'll be very brief on this. But it's important to note in discussing the origins and early development of wandering in its Orthodox Christian iteration that we take note of the fact that initially this practice belongs equally to the cultural heritage of the Christian East and the Christian West. As noted earlier, the first Christians were often compared to wanderers in the metaphoric sense. Moreover, in the Middle Ages, a feeling of impermanence, that is, of the ephemerality of earthly existence, pervaded the mentality of medieval European Christians who truly felt themselves, quote, mere wanderers in this world. Adding to this, medieval historian C.H. Lawrence explains how in the 11th century, a renewed interest in and knowledge of primitive Christianity, particularly the apostolic life, led to the establishment in the Catholic West of various mendicant orders, such as the Dominicans and the Franciscans. Orders which, in addition to voluntary poverty, included itinerant preaching as one of their key practices. Although the mendicants eventually lost influence and prestige in Western Europe with the onslaught of the Enlightenment, in Russia the practice of religious wandering continued. And as one scholar, D. Dorofeev, goes on to point out, seems to have acquired more meaning within the culture precisely because it did not as it did in the West, diffuse among several different groups, but remained, as he put it, a holistic type. Also, early Russian literature, whoops, I went too fast. Early Russian literature, while connected in some ways with wandering, was very deeply connected with the related phenomenon of pilgrimage. Commencing right at the beginning of the 12th century, we have perhaps the first written pilgrimage account, Russian pilgrimage account under the title The Life and Pilgrimage of the Abbot Daniil from the Russian Land, believed to be written between 1806, 1808, but now it's debated by scholars. Most recent scholarship says between 1113 and 1115. From Daniil's 12th century trip until the end of the 19th century, literally over 1,000 travelogues will be written of Russian pilgrimages and pilgrim-like travel to places like Constantinople, Mount Athos, Egypt, the Levant, of course, the Holy Land, and particularly in the 19th century, places within Russia. In addition, we have the apocryphal accounts of mystical journeys, the journey of Father Agape to heaven, for example, and the passage of the Mother of God to the torments, which is probably the most well-known example of a journey in the other direction. In this 4th century apocryphal legend, which became known in Slavonic in the 10th century, Mary, the Mother of God, in Greek Theotokos, in Slavonic Bogorodica, asked the Archangel Michael to show her the various tortures endured by sinners in hell. One could also claim that the old believer Avakum in the mid-17th century was a kind of wanderer, and one could also name the wandering Ukrainian philosopher Grigory Skovoroda from the 18th century. You add to this tradition of pilgrimage in Russia, a tradition that spanned different classes, although it was mainly centered in the peasantry, and you can see what a big part of Russian spirituality or spirituality within the Russian Empire, you can see what a big part wandering and pilgrimage were. However, the part which I would like to focus on, which I focus on in the book, is the period from the mid-19th century to the end of the 19th century, where the wanderer's significance for Russia would no longer be relegated to the realm of religious society alone, but would be catapulted into the view of the country's literary elite, an elite that had been considerably secularized after the reforms of Peter the Great in the 18th century. This was in part due to the way in which the interest in the practice of wandering coincided with the intellectual's burgeoning fascination with the peasantry, both before and after the abolition of serfdom in February of 1861. Here, in the midst of a general interest in all things having to do with the life of the common people, in the words of Kathy A. Frierson, special emphasis was given to the peasants', quote, moral and mental makeup, end quote, as well as his, quote, system of beliefs, frequently labeled the peasant soul, end quote. It was during this period that several authors, both minor and major, began incorporating wanderers and pilgrims into their works as representatives of the lived faith of the common people. Among those covered in my book are Fyodor Dostoevsky, Mikhail Saltykov-Shchedrin, Nikolai Nekrasov, Nikolai Leskov, Leo or Lev Tolstoy, Fyodor Tyutchev, and Pavel Melnikov-Pechersky, all of whom tried their hand at describing wanderer characters. Through the knowledge of the common people, Russian intellectuals hoped to gain a clearer sense of national self-definition and possibly direction for the country's political future. This school of thought has been labeled by some as narodnichestvo, often translated in English as populism. There are different definitions of this word, some broad, some more narrow, but I think it's important to note that narodnichestvo, in its broad sense, and the intellectual inquisitiveness concerning wandering and pilgrimage corresponded with a mid-19th century boom in Russian ethnography and folklore research, which included the appearance of several compilations of folk material, such as Vladimir Dail's collection of folk proverbs, Pyotr Kireevsky's anthology of folk songs, and the publication of Alexander Afanasyev and Pavel Rybnikov's extensive store of folk tales and folk epics. And let me just turn to this slide of Pyotr Vasilievich Kireevsky, who I'll be talking a bit in a moment. There was also the founding in 1845 of the ethnographic division of the Russian Geographical Society. And all of this points to a growing interest in the common people's rituals, stories, spiritual beliefs, and customs, which many intellectuals saw as having more ancient roots and thus being more authentically Russian than the European-influenced imperial traditions. In this connection, Russian intellectuals were to be found searching not so much for typical peasants as for so-called carriers, nasitsili, from among the common people of the old religious culture of Rus. As we mentioned above, one of the key compilers of this in this genre was that of Slavophile writer, translator, and folklorist Pyotr Vasilievich Kireevsky, whose collection Songs of the Russian People, Русские народные песни, would eventually comprise 10 published volumes and contained anywhere from 10 to 15,000 songs. Importantly, the very first publication of Kireevsky's research in 1848 was devoted specifically to the Russian people's spiritual verses, the verses of the Kaliki Perihorji, which we talked about earlier. And he characterizes these verses as, quote, the fruits of the common people's imagination, plody narodной fantazii, and not church hymns or, quote, poems composed by the clergy. So he contrasts them as truly works of the people. It's hard to overemphasize the reach of Kireevsky's collection among intellectuals and writers of that time, all the more so because several of them contributed to the collection themselves, including most famously Alexander Pushkin and Nikolai Gogol, who both bequeathed to Kireevsky notebooks filled with songs, but also historian Mikhail Pogodin and Vladimir Dail, who was a fellow folklorist and, of course, the compiler of Russia's most famous dictionary, all of whom donated songs that they themselves had recorded on paper. Additionally, at around the same time, the first 10 volumes of Kireevsky's songs were published in 1860, other collections came off the presses. There was the collection of Russian spiritual verses by Viktor Gavrilovich Vorontsov, and a compilation of spiritual verses under the title Wandering Cripples, a collection of verses and research by Pyotr Alexeyevich Bessonov. Like Kireevsky in the introductory remarks to their collections, Vorontsov and Bessonov both point to the ancient origin of these spiritual verses, positioning the Kaliki wanderers as the preservers of the religious and, to some extent, literary traditions of early Rus. This same view would be promulgated in 1862 by the renowned folklorist Fyodor Ivanovich Buslaev. And I want to mention in this regard also that all of this could be considered Russia's version of a European-wide movement in folkloristics and literary analysis known as the mythological school, which held that fairy tales, folk poetry, and legends have their origin in religious myths and were manifestations of a, quote, collective folk spirit. Indeed, to a certain extent, the spiritual verses mentioned above amount to what could accurately be labeled a repository of Russian religious lore and mythologized history, as they were replete with both genuine historical personas, such as Vladimir Sviatoslavich, or the Grand Prince of Kiev, and bogatyr heroes of legend, such as Dobrynya Nikitich and Alyosha Popovich. But while these folklorists certainly represent the traveling religious songsters as carriers of the culture of Rus, on the more strictly Christian dogmatic side, it could not be said that either Vorontsov or Bessonov, for example, appeared as apologists for the people's religious beliefs, nor do they proffer these beliefs as something intellectual Russians should adopt themselves, as both Fyodor Dostoevsky and Leo Tolstoy would later do. In fact, Vorontsov, in his introduction to his collection, characterizes the Kaliki's verses as, quote, unhappy, monotonous, and sorrowful, невеселый, однообразный и тоскливый. Further noting how religion in these chants appeared to the people as something threatening and punishing, грозный и карающий, and according to him, contributed to the Russian folk becoming despondent and afraid, подавленным и запуганным. Another study of Russia's wandering also takes a rather disparaging view of the phenomenon, and this is Sergei Maximov's study of various types of religious wanderers under the title Wandering Rus for the Sake of Christ, where he insists that though collectors, for example, are, quote, dear to a great number of Russians, quote, they have lived long enough have they wandered about the world. In general, these late by an entire century beggars have so lagged behind our present age of wisdom that they seem to be dressed in a coffin shroud. However, by way of contrast, I would like to mention another compiler of the people's folk verses and songs, who did, in fact, go quite a long way toward imitating the life of the wanderers whose verbal culture he was in the process of chronicling. This was Pavel Ivanovich Yekushkin, one of Kireevsky's most enthusiastic aides in assembling the latter's collection of folk songs, and whose own compilations, his own compendiums, titled Russian Folk Songs Collected by Yekushkin and Russian Folk Songs from the Collection of P.I. Yekushkin, were published in 1860 and 1865, respectively. Yekushkin, just has an interesting history that I'll just briefly mention. Yekushkin was the son of a well-off aristocrat living in the Oryol province who had married an enserfed peasant woman. Though given an aristocratic education, in his early years, Yekushkin even then showed a predilection for the peasants' look and language and mimicked both, to the extent that his German teacher even gave him the nickname peasant scarecrow, muzhikska chuchilka. That's his original quote. This would-be folklorist then entered Moscow University in 1840, but later quit and decided to devote himself entirely to collecting people's songs. For this reason, as well as to achieve maximum closeness with the providers of these songs and verses, he literally took up the life of a wanderer, like a wanderer salesman, dressed in peasant garb, carrying upon his shoulders a box of goods with which he planned to obtain by barter the desired songs and other ethnographic material. And he set on foot to peregrinate throughout the Russian Empire. He covered an impressive amount of territory, beginning with the Volga region, the Kostroma province. He covered the environs of Rostov and Peryslavl, the shores of Pskov Lake and Lake Ilman, and finally the Kharkov province, which was at that time part of the Russian Empire. He is described as moving about the mud and lack of roads, po gryazyi и бездорожнице, and knocking at more than one peasant home for a place to spend the nights, and even being refused in a number of cases. At the same time, he was able to witness for himself the high regard and hospitality with which the common people often treated wanderers. And he recalls how once he was given fresh milk, or another time when a group of fishermen presented him with the choicest parts of the catch, which with to make fish soup, ucha. In St. Petersburg, Yekushkin was hailed as the man who had, quote, walked through all of Russia on foot. However, there were also accounts of Yekushkin's frequent drunkenness, which he claimed was the result of attempts to collect his songs among peasant patrons of local taverns, and at times uncouth and inappropriate behavior. In the last decade of his life, Yakushkin was even arrested and placed under police surveillance. However, he still managed to publish his stories on Russian historical events and peasant life and continued to collect folklore. I mention Yakushkin because he appears in under a different name, under Pavlusha Veritennikov. He appears in Nikolai Nekrasov's poem "Who Lives Happily in Russia" or "Кому на Руси жить хорошо." And I won't read this whole passage, but you can see it here on the screen. This incident where Pavlusha Veritennikov buys some boots for a grandfather who wanted to give these little boots to his granddaughter was an incident in the life of Yakushkin, of Pavel Yakushkin, and so it was taken by Nikolai Nekrasov, and he's just given the name Pavlusha Veritennikov, but everybody acquainted with Yakushkin would recognize this as being referred as this refers to Yakushkin. Okay. Also, interestingly, a fairly abundant source of information on wanderers could also be found amidst writers and intellectuals tasked with investigating the Old Believer Wanderer sect on behalf of the Tsarist government. And here we come across an interesting problem, because while these commissions were often set up with the purpose of eventually wiping out the wandering sect, those tasked with carrying out such studies were often sympathetic with some of the aspects of the sectarian's political and or religious Weltanschauung, either because on the Slavophile side, they saw it as a phenomenon testifying to the deep religiosity of the common people, or on the political left, they saw old belief as evidence of the Russian people's ability to resist the rule of the state and Tsarist, the rule of the church and the Tsarist state, as well as perceiving in these sectarians the possible seeds for creative ideas regarding a new social political organization of the Russian Empire. So, for example, on one such commission, you have the Slavophile writer Ivan Sergeyevich Aksakov, the poet and a publicist. And he was tasked with investigating the Stranniki Beguni, the wanderer, those who flee, sect in the small town of Sapelki, just outside the city of Yaroslavl. And he describes in a letter to his parents, he describes them as several gangs of robbers, bandits, and horse thieves, and whose cause he claims in the report he gives to the commission was merely a cover-up for various crimes. So here in this this quote that I have for you from his report: has a soldier escaped from his regiment, a peasant serf from his obligations to his landowner, a young peasant woman from her husband, all of them Orthodox, all found justification for their misconduct in the teaching of the wanderers, which has elevated vagrancy to a religious dogma and the escapee to a kind of priest. However, in spite of all Aksakov's official invectives against the wandering sect, the Slavophile writer was not all that condemning of wandering up until this point, but was actually quite well known for a long poem he had written in 1847 to 1850 called The Vagrant, Bradyaga, in which he describes the escape of a young peasant from the estate to which he was enserfed and his subsequent wanderings as he tries to find other work and a new life for himself. And I just have one stanza from the poem here, but you know, it points to how wandering, almost the expanse itself, Russia's vastness itself seems to call to him to adopt the wandering life and to leave his station as a enserfed peasant. In their alarmed reaction to the poem, Russian government officials even had Aksakov briefly arrested, expressing their concern over the possible socio-political repercussions of the work, which they claimed promulgated the view that within vagrancy lay promises of freedom and lack of accountability. When asked specifically to why he chose to write about an escapee for his subject of his poem, Aksakov provided the following explanation. And I'll just read part of this. I want to make sure we're doing well on time here. Because it is one of the phenomena of our common people's life, because the vagrant walking across the whole of Russia, as if it were his home, gives me the opportunity to make a poetic description of Russian nature and Russian everyday life in its various forms. And you can read the rest of that quotation, but I thought I would include that for you. Also, just another two other people I'd like to mention from the political left who were inspired by various aspects of this wandering sect. Well, one of them was Afanasy Prokopievich Shapov, who in his famous essay under the title Land Councils and the Schism, he explains that the proliferation of old ritualism, including its radical brother, the Stranniki Biguni, he explains that they were a response to the gradual disenfranchisement of the peasants, and declares that to escape and flee was a kind of fatal necessity and way of salvation for people in such dire straits. Mirroring Shapov, I have another intellectual, again, who is traditionally associated with the left and worked with Alexander Herzen, is Vasily Ivanovich Kilsiev. And he actually went and met the wanderers, the wandering sect who had escaped from Russia and residing overseas in places around present-day Romania and areas of Eastern Europe. And he had this to say about them, that while he characterized them superficially, condemns them as coarser and more ferocious than other sectarians, he also writes, as you can see on your screen, they were brought to the level of savages. The police have so squeezed the common people, have so crushed them with passport requirements, that there was nothing left to do but drop everything in this world and go off into the forest. So Kilseyev reflects, again, that this one position is to sort of look at various aspects of the wanderers, reflecting their sort of political situation, but it doesn't mean that they necessarily buy into the religious vision of these wanderers. I mean, Kilseyev himself never became an old believer. He did, however, go back to Russia, renounce his radical views, and ask for pardon from the Tsar, which he received, and he even got a government appointment in St. Petersburg. But I mentioned that, the reason I mentioned that, because getting into some of the writers, and I'm going to be selective in who I talk about here, because I know I don't have that much time left. We notice two different approaches. There's an approach which I'd like to call perhaps a more anthropological approach, narodnichestvo approach, which was inspired by interest in folklore and folkloristics, and seems to look at wandering as an element of the Russian people's originality, but again, does not necessarily share in the religious aspect of it. And then there'll be other writers like Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, for example, who look at the wanderer as a kind of teacher and behavioral model and an indicator of how to escape the spiritual vacuity or spiritual bereft materialism that they claimed had sort of gripped the intellectual class, to escape the continual aping of European ways, which they felt had infected the Russian educated elite. So looking at this more sort of anthropological, folklore-based interest, we have Nikolai Alexeyevich Nekrasov, and primarily his poem Vlas which the Norwegian scholar Paul Costa mentions for many Russians was their first encounter with strannik spirituality. And this was published in the journal The Contemporary as early as 1855. Nekrasov, as you may know, is famous in Russian literature as the people's poet for his attempts to realistically present the hard life of the common people in his oeuvre as a consistent theme. And you may know him for his longstanding interest in folklore. So I'll get to the poem here. The poem Vlas begins by solemnly setting the stage of the eponymous hero's life story in reverse. Vlas is a sborshchik, a collector, wandering from town to town as he begs alms for the construction of a church. From the very start, however, there are already hints that Vlas's current peregrination is no mere ecclesial assignment, but is an act of repentance in the closing years of a harsh, bitter, and evidently sinful life. So I'll just read the first two stanzas here. Varmekye с открытым воротом, с обнаженной головой, медленно проходит городом дядя Влас, старик седой. На груди икона медная, просит он на Божий храм, весь в веригах обувь бедная, на щеке глубокий шрам. The poem then goes on to describe the raison d'être of Vlas's penance. The namesake hero in his former life, quote, drove his wife to her grave, harbored all kinds of riffraff, and was himself a very cynical example of a rich peasant or kulak, one involved in hoarding and price gouging. However, upon falling gravely ill, Vlas has a vision of the eternal retribution for his crimes, a vision that evokes, to borrow a phrase from Lindy Ivanitz, the cosmology of folklore, hagiography, and many apocryphal texts, which are held in high esteem by the people. And we'll see here, and I'll point to it, images that evoke the passage of the Mother of God to the torments, as well as many spiritual verse songs dedicated to the Last Judgment, like those found in Kireyevsky's collection. And so I'm not going to read this, but you can see the sort of the imagery, the almost Dantean sort of imagery of this this vision that Vlas has. Now, at the same time, he's portrayed as a rather contrite and repentant peasant. He is also, there are some indications that he had not completely given up his rebelliousness. And one scholar, Eugene Clay, points out that Vlas's wearing of a copper icon does not appear to be an accidental detail. Although the Holy Synod had in fact prohibited such icons in 1722, as Clay notes, it was reported that such copper icons were particularly venerated among the Stranniki sect of Old Believers. At the same time, there is a great national symbolism in Vlas's penitential travels. For the space of his salvific ascetic struggle, which he makes even harder by wearing the virigi, the iron chains, turns out to be virtually the whole of Russia itself. His journey taking him to symbolic parts within the empire, and thus making him, in a sense, emblematic of a peasant bogatyr, warrior hero, in a kind of composite representation of the country's peasant population, which again puts Russia in the position of a salvific landscape. Here's a passage which I have put on the screen. Hopefully, if you know the general geography, you'll see that he has Moscow, the Caspian to the south, then Astrakhan also to the south, Ryazan closer to Moscow. He has a mention of the Neva, which would refer to St. Petersburg, right? So it's kind of like a 3-point, 4-point sort of compass, right, of the whole country, or at least the European part of the country. Okay. Now, Vlas actually, in anticipated the appearance in print of some of these collections. He didn't anticipate Kireevsky's collection, which came before this which was published, but he did anticipate several of the other collections. And this last stanza, «И дают прохожие, так из лепты трудовой вырастают храмы Божии, полиция земли родной», that would actually serve as the epigraph to Maximov's Wandering Rus for the sake of Christ. And so you can see a correlation here between the folklore studies and the writers, right, who evidently borrowed from each other. I just want to quote, I want to show you something that I found somewhat amusing, but not everybody appreciated Nekrasov's inclusion of folkloric material in here, particularly those for whom the ethical message in literature was the most important. So we have Tolstoy's description of the poem Vlas, according to Dmitry Merezhkovsky. This is what Tolstoy had to say. This is an absurdity, a monstrosity, blasphemy. I cannot accept religious instruction in such a hideous form. There are no Ethiopian scorpions or six-winged tigers in the gospel. One cannot derive any moral rule from it. Turgenev also wrote more cryptically that it would have been better if Vlas had never been published. So we see here that there was some pushback on this generous use of folkloric material. I just want to mention how, again, to just reiterate how this shows that for people like Nekrasov, even though they admired, excuse me, admired the people's faith and and highlighted in their work, they weren't necessarily trying to make that something that the intellectuals should adopt. And in one part of Nekrasov's poem, Who Lives Happily in Russia, you can see here he actually goes into how oftentimes these pilgrims would simply be praying. They would simply be pulling the wool over the people's eyes, and they might be dishonest and simply trying to get something from the people by telling them made up stories of places that they actually hadn't been to. So, but in spite of that, what is interesting is that Nekrasov will go on to say, whoever has seen the peasant family how the peasant family listens to the visiting wanderers will understand that not work, nor life's constant cares and concerns, nor the yoke of prolonged slavery, nor the tavern itself has placed any limits on the Russian common folk. Before them is a wide path. So he looks at this as a strength of the people, while at the same time not exactly sharing in that religious vision. You see the same type of thing with writers like Mikhail Saltykov-Shchedrin. And I'll just show you a passage from his work. He has a whole part of his novel called Provincial Sketches, where he's got a whole chapter devoted to wanderers and pilgrims. And there's one pilgrim in particular named Pakhomovna. And at first he starts out with a realistic portrayal of Pakhomovna and her journeys, but then it kind of transfers into this mystification, or we're not sure if he's trying to say that this really happened, or more likely he's going into the mind of the wanderer, Pakhomovna, and this is her mystical vision. And so, here the serpent itself, the most wicked by nature of all God's creatures, tries to tempt her. Again, we know that Saltykov-Shchedrin, for his part, even though he says in his novel that he's not prepared to argue with people's faith, with the strength of faith, in an unpublished at that time, later published essay, he writes really condemning the practice of asceticism, claiming that it represents a desire for an abstract state where one is cut off not only from the charming and ever tempestuous outside world, but from one's very from one's very self. And he even he says, only extraordinary blindness and fanatical barbarity could blind an entire could bind an entire folk mass to such anti-social endeavor, So, asceticism is at the heart of wandering. So again, while he sort of celebrates it almost folkloristically, he doesn't necessarily believe in it as far as its religious message. However, contrast that with Tolstoy. And I want to share with you a passage from Tolstoy's novel Childhood that came out in 1852. And here we have an example of a wanderer who, this is a semi-autobiographical novel where Tolstoy is explaining his life growing up on an estate, and the family is visited by a wanderer by the name of Grisha. And he describes Grisha, as you can see in this passage, very sympathetically, and calls him a great Christian. Oh, great Christian Grisha, your faith was so strong, you felt the nearness of God. And within this passage and in various parts of Tolstoy's work, we can see that he really does admire some aspects of Grisha's character. And I want to just mention something here he says about wanderers and holy fools. The aspect that Tolstoy seems to admire is among wanderers and holy fools. He considered this readiness to embrace scorn, which was not only admirable, but crucial in light of the devastating effects of the human desire for commendation. As Tolstoy puts it, so harmful, so insurmountable is the temptation of human praise, which is always lavished on good deeds, that it is impossible not to sympathize with an effort not only to avoid praise, but to elicit contempt from people. And in this sense, the wanderer is very much like a holy fool, in the sense that the holy fool seeks out scorn and rejection through his often provocative behavior. The wanderer opens himself up to the very real possibility or probability of such scorn through his appeal to others for his sustenance. And so the last thing I want to mention vis-a-vis Tolstoy is the fact that by calling him a great Christian, of course, by calling Grisha a great Christian, he is suggesting this is a model for society as a whole, because even though many intellectuals were not particularly religious by this time, nominally they were Orthodox Christians, and so this was really calling them, excuse me, this is really calling them to kind of be sort of closer to that sense of earnestness with which Grisha, the holy wanderer, seems to pray. Let's see, I'm coming to the very end of my time, and I'll close with Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky. This will be my last example. And Dostoevsky also has a wanderer in his novel, The Adolescent. And the wanderer's name is Makar Dolgoruki. and he is just a little bit of plot. He's the legal father of the namesake of the novel, the adolescent Arkady Dolgoruki. And Arkady Dolgoruki is the son of a man by the name of Versilov, who was the landowner. So basically, Arkady's father absconds with Makar's wife, Arkady's mother, and they live in a kind of a civil union, civil marriage, and Arkady is then visited by the man that adopted him, Versilov's former peasant, who has since become a wanderer, who went from being a serf, and when his wife was taken away from him, he became a wanderer. And the novel describes how he changes after this experience of becoming a wanderer. You can see in the excerpt here, he becomes just a lot more humble, and he becomes he's referred to as a saint and a man who has suffered much. And he becomes the kind of intellectual foil or juxtaposition to the landowner Versilov, who's portrayed as this deracinated, Weltschmerzy, world-weary intellectual who's been wandering in Europe and not in his homeland, wandering in Europe, gathering all their sort of Enlightenment ideas, but distancing himself from the Russian people, whereas Makar Ivanovich Dolgoruki, he has been wandering within Russia and sort of gaining that religious influence from the Russian land. And I'll close with this quote, which is basically the quote from which I take the title of my book. And this is a doctor who has come to take care of Makar Dolgoruki, and he tries to categorize him and senses that he initially calls him a wanderer, but then senses that's too positive. So he switches to the word vagrancy and then claims that the entire Russian people are vagrants. So I'll close with this. You, Makar Ivanovich, are carried away by longing to live by your own will, Volushka, and longing for the road. You have become unaccustomed to living in one place. Aren't you, after all, a so-called wanderer, strannik? And vagrancy, бродяжество, is almost becoming a passion in our common people. I have noticed that more than once in our common people. Our common people are a vagrant, бродяга, before anything.
Let's maybe start from like a more general thing about the role of religious wandering in like the Soviet Union and modern Russia. What role does it play culturally, and if it exists in any form in modern Russia?
Well, I really did not detect anything in like with the advent of the Soviet Union. I mean, it was very difficult, this kind of thing, because people had to be registered in a town, right? They had propiska, which seems to really put a very significant restriction on wandering. I did see some accounts that there may have been some wanderers in various places. As a whole, though, as a kind of a part and parcel of a larger Orthodox culture, of course, it really starts to die down. And I haven't heard of many cases today, although no doubt there are a few. The whole tradition of long pilgrimages, though, is apparently coming back in many places. And I heard that the pilgrimage that you can actually walk from, there's a path you can walk from Moscow to Sergiev Posad, or the Trinity Sergius Monastery, the way that is described in Ivan Shmilyov's Bogomolye pilgrimage, that there's actually a way to do that. But yeah, was severely curtailed in Soviet times, as I know. Yeah.
Richard is wondering, could you say something about the famous way of the pilgrim and its textual history?
Yeah, I chose in my book I do mention that I don't really look at the way of the pilgrim because I'm looking at texts that describe wanderers and not necessarily like the way of the pilgrim is like he's a wanderer himself, but is looking for someone to teach him the Jesus prayer, right? And yeah, and my focus in my book was more on depictions of wanderers. Uh, it also it comes kind of at the end of the historical time period, which I'm looking at the very end of the 18th century. So I mentioned it in the book, but I really don't describe it at length. Yeah, that and like the the Enchanted Wanderer, for example, by Nikolai Nekrasov. This also comes up, you know, works that have Wanderer in the title. And I devote some time to that, but that's more of based on a kind of a European adventure novel, English adventure novel, than it is on wandering as a religious practice. But I don't really look at much of to be honest, at the right, the notes of the wanderer, the confessions of the wanderer to his spiritual father. It's sort of it's a little bit outside of the purview of my research.
Mm-hmm. Sure, and we received another question from Dennis. Was endorsement of wanderers in the 19th century intellectuals ever construed as criticism of the more established Orthodox Church?
Um, yeah, I mean, that's a good question. It is, it depends who you're talking about. Because certainly in the case of Tolstoy, yeah, I mean, he would often contrast wanderers and holy fools in these with official ecclesial, with people within the church, and for him it was, and for example, Father Sergei, right, Father Sergius, his work that wasn't published until the early 1900s, right, but describes somebody who is initially a monk, but doesn't find true humility in monasticism because, according to Tolstoy, in monasticism, there's too much influence of people admiring the various monks and people coming to ask them for advice. And it's only when the protagonist becomes a wanderer at the end of the novel that he finds true humility when a foreigner thinks he's a beggar and gives him a some sort of money, and the foreigners are talking to each other and to their Russian guide in French, which of course, if you know the story, Father Seri comes from an intellectual and an aristocratic background. He can understand them, but he chooses not to reveal himself as a former sort of intellectual aristocrat, and he humbly takes his. So he's achieved true humility through being a wanderer and outside of the church hierarchy. In his case, yes. Dostoevsky doesn't really try to contrast them that much. I mean, in fact, he had a article entitled Vlas, where he discusses Vlas, and he discusses somebody who repents of his sins and a truly inventive sin, and he tries to shoot the Eucharist on a stick as a result of a dare that somebody gives him. He repents. He sort of wanders. He's like a second Vlas, but that's told through, according to Dostoevsky, through a priest that he had consulted, that he had been talking to, and the priest came for a confession in the Orthodox Church. So with Dostoevsky, less so. With Tolstoy, certainly, and with those who I mentioned on the political left, like with Shapov, for example, with um, definitely with Kilsiev, they definitely contrasted the wanderers with the official church and made a point of making that contrast for sure. Yeah.
Nikolai asks a great question. To what extent was wandering simply a way of escaping from serfdom? They escaped serfs who called themselves wanderers and were eventually found by the authorities. Were they returned to their owner? And were there any laws protecting the wandering way of life?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It often was a way of escape. And one part that I didn't get to, and this is what Aksakov alludes to in his poem, The Wanderer. Um, but I didn't have a chance to talk about, but I do talk about it in the book. People who escape the empire under the guise of being a wanderer and who are lured to these places by tales of lands that were believed to exist. Like one was called Bielavoidia, which was supposedly existed somewhere beyond the Altai Mountains. Uh, and it was a place where it was reported that old believers could live in freedom, practicing their belief without any uh, without anything without any impingement from the Tsarist authorities, and a significant portion of that was being free from serfdom. There's no doubt about it, being free from serfdom. And what's interesting, I was reading this book as part of my research by man, his last name is Chistov, and he mentions the fact that Russia had had so much reserve lands. I mean, there's so much space, and that theoretically you could escape it was very hard to do and very difficult, but theoretically, and in fact, people did manage to escape from serfdom, and that's where that's what engendered these tales of fantastical lands where people would escape to serfdom. And there's a whole bunch of them. And they all have to do with escape. The whole legend of Kizhi, also not Kizhi, of Kitish, the whole legend of Kitish, this disappearing city. But I would say yes, definitely, and it could be just a. I think Nekrasov also alludes to this in his poem that sometimes wandering was simply a cover from for just escaping. And no, the authorities would not give you special. You had to have a special permission. You had to have a special permission to be a collector. You had a special book and a stamp in it, which by your parish. You needed special permission to go on a pilgrimage, like to the Holy Land. You would need that approved by the mir in which you lived, the village, and you would need it approved by the authorities. And they didn't give anyone a special treatment in that regard. You would be returned to your landowner. Famously, there's the account of Fyodor Kuzmich, who many claim this wanderer, who some claim was the Emperor Alexander I, who had, according to this, I know there's people who believe in this, and I'm not going to take sides in this. According to the story or information, he apparently faked his own death when he was in Taganrog, and then appears as the wanderer Fyodor Kuzmich. Whether that's true or not, I'm not going to go there, but Fyodor Kuzmich, a wanderer, was arrested by the authorities. It's partly how we know about him in the area of the Ural Mountains in that area. And then he later became a hermit and was eventually served a kind of penal servitude at a factory and later was allowed to be a hermit. But originally he was arrested. So under that statute I mentioned, Bradyazhestvo, which was officially illegal not to have any papers. You needed a permit or you couldn't do it and you would be returned.
As far as I know, this archetype of a religious wanderer or like bradyagi is important for Russian painters, right?
Mhm.
You can probably see something in the Tretikovskaya gallery and other places in Russia. Could you maybe tell us just a little bit more about it? Because I think it's also important to mention that this archetype wasn't just about literature, right?
The very first one is, in fact, a painting in the that's held by the Tretyakov, and that if everything goes well, that'll be the cover of my book, hopefully. Um, But yeah, there were a group of artists in the 19th century called the Wanderers, but it's a different name. It's передвижники, sort of going because they took their exhibits, from one town to the next. And the Wanderer was indeed an important subject for their art. And yeah, and again, it was thought to be emblematic of peasant Russia, of the common people's belief system and their worldview. And so you can see there's something very like engrossing about this wanderer. This painting is based on a real person, on their sort of expression. And you can see also, let's see, I have some more paint. These were photographs I have here taken of wanderers. This one is from the late 19th century. But yeah, if I had more time, I would have put more paintings in there, because it was an important, like people like Vasily Surikov, um, people like Vasily Pirov and others. There was quite frequent depictions of wanderers in painting, and beautiful pictures of, like there's one that have like a cornfield or a wheat field and the wanderer sort of going through it. And of course, the probably most famous, you could count it as a wandering painting, would be Isaac Levitan's Vladimirka, where you just see this the road that sort of goes off, and there's like a little station or a little marker there, or mile marker, verst marker. Yeah, and I include those. Those will be part of the illustrations for the book. Some paintings of wanderers going through this sort of vast territory, vast canvas. Yeah.